Our first presenter is Richard Slaughter, and he's online for us from Australia.
Yes, good morning. Can everyone hear me?
Raise your hand. We can see you. Yes.
Excellent. I'm not sure if I look a bit like a ghost with this lighting here, but I guess that doesn't matter too much. Well, I thought I would start by just going back a few years and looking at a special issue of Futures that I edited on the Federation. And the editorial of that special issue ended up by trying to summarize the themes that at that time it seemed to me, looking at all the contributions to that issue, had created the Federation and continued to inspire those working within it. So in a way, this provided a bit of a context, I think, for really where we are now. So these are the points that emerged, and let me just add that this editorial and the background paper for the conference, I've put both of them on my weblog. That's richardslaughter.com.au under the heading of Action Resources. And I do that for most presentations so that people can pull down from it what they want. And this editorial, for example, gives an overview of what that special issue on the Federation was all about. So the points that emerged were, first of all, critiquing power. Secondly, exploring alternatives to the status quo. Equipping people with the means to define and explore futures of their choice. Encouraging the young to understand and take charge of their world. Encouraging a range of social innovations, including futures in education, and building the futures foresight domain in both theoretical and applied ways, inducting newcomers into the field, and really with a focus here which reflects the title of the conference, collectively exploring the grounds of futures beyond dystopia. So that gives you a kind of outline of the context. And as I said, that's available to be checked out by anyone if they're interested. So basically here, in a few minutes, I'll try and keep this fairly concise because I know you're running rather late. I want to talk a little bit about the unusual present that we live in, the very distinctive and historically unprecedented now. My entree to this world really happened at the end of 1945 when world population was, can you believe, around 2 billion. It's now over 7. Cars were uncommon in the town I grew up in. Television was non-existent. My grandmother's tiny house was lit by gas. My father walked to work every single day, and my mother cycled everywhere. Then I looked up a few stats from that time. During the 50s and 60s in the UK, GDP annually grew by 4 to 6%, and global industrial production tripled in the 20 years from 1950 to 1970. So the reason I'm touching on those stats, you could all come up with similar ones, is that it was the beginning of this historically unprecedented period of growth and development, from which we've all benefited. However, I would suggest that the overall costs have now exceeded what anyone could have possibly imagined at that time. We live in a truly non-normal and unsustainable world. We all know this. So I'm going to skip over all the bio stuff and go to some of the things I think I've learned during this period, and then to maybe briefly explain the title of the paper about getting to the heart of things. The reason for that title is essentially that I've had a decade to think and reflect and read and write, and that has enabled me to get really what I suppose I'd call a deeper sense of the world and what it contains and why it's so precious and wonderful. In terms of foundations, however, in terms of what I've learned, it is important to have some reliable points of reference amongst all the flux and upheaval around us. That seems certain to continue. So a question everyone needs to answer for themselves is, what do I rely on during those periods of change and uncertainty? A couple of simple things might be appreciation for beauty, or the love of one's family, children, and so forth. For me, that's all true, but being a futurist, I think my sense of foundations have been greatly enhanced by the entire corpus of the futures literature. Not that I've read it all, of course, but coming from that, the work of the people who started before us and who contributed to this amazing resource. People like Wendell Bell, Robert Junk, Eleanor Massini, people like Elise Balding, Hazel Henderson, and so on. And as some of you know, I found Wilbur's 4-quadrant model handy as well, like a set of glasses that you can put on and take off, and you don't wear them all the time. But what they enable anyone to do is to check on any occasion, are we covering all the basic spots that we should cover? Or is anything important being left out? A second requirement, I think, is self-knowledge. And that's something that really came up. You can see that very clearly if you go to Delphi. And there's carved in by the Greeks and their temple, know thyself and everything in moderation, to which we often add, including moderation. So knowing yourself seems to be really essential. And part of that is to be able to deal with disappointments and failures. Being a futurist is not an easy choice, especially if you elect to work outside the realm of the rich and powerful. In that context, I found it vital to stay connected to the people and sources of energy and insight that can provide support when needed. It's absolutely critical, I think, for myself to recognize that we're all and always part of a collective. I really don't believe in the lone futurist. Everything we do is based on what resources other people have developed and made available to us. Obviously, one turns to family, friends, mentors. Mentors are terribly important, both having them and being a mentor to other people down the track. Some of the things that have been helpful too in terms of dealing with the ups and downs of life as a futurist are those times when you go to a hands-on workshop, and you probably have that experience in Turku this week. Two that I can mention briefly are Imagining a World Without Weapons, based on the work of Elise Balding and Warren Ziegler. But perhaps the standout in my experience is one held in Cumbria at a Buddhist monastery called Manjushri Institute about 20 years ago, maybe more, organized and run by Joanna Macy, who's often well known for her book, Despair and Personal Power in the Nuclear Age. Now that workshop was called Personal and Spiritual Resources for Healing Our World. And it had an absolutely catalytic effect on me. And I've never forgotten it. And I've never lost the insight and inspiration that came from there. Another thing is about managing success. We all aim for success, but being successful in any field doesn't actually make one more important or less likely to make mistakes. In fact, success can feed the ego in ways that are counterproductive. Part of self-knowledge, therefore, is to stay open, to be alert to the traps of ego, and to take active steps to compensate for the loss of feedback that you get as you become more successful. Two wonderful examples in my life are Professor Hedley Beer from Melbourne Uni, with whom I co-wrote Education for the 21st Century. And this experience, which I write about in a little more detail in the paper, led me to suggest some years later that, especially when it comes to writing, we should really try and ensure that there's no ego involved at all. There should be very little or none in writing or editing. What matters is the result. So we all enjoy praise, it affirms our wealth, our worth, I mean, our sense of well-being. But as time has gone by, I've genuinely come to regard sturdy critique as more useful. It's nice to be praised, but I find that I only learn when people disagree with me and challenge my views. The other model is Wendell Bell, who I know many of you know and appreciate, and he's always been a generous, supportive friend and colleague. What's interesting about Wendell, partly, apart from his sheer humanity, which I think everyone understands, is that he took what for many is a fairly extreme view in the futures field, which is that he believed that, and he made this point many times, that every act of looking forward involved prediction. And I believe that prediction is such a problematic concept that it's best to reserve it for very specific situations where you have all the factors. And indeed, prediction makes sense, like phases of the moon, that sort of thing. But this is the point. Despite having that underlying disagreement with Wendell for all those years, it was barely ever mentioned because the quality of the interaction between us was always of a different nature. It didn't really matter that much in that context. So drawing on those two examples, I would suggest that the bottom line for making the best of whatever success comes one way is to embody the spirit of generosity. Then on being productive, that just seems to come with the territory. I could reflect, but I think there isn't really time on several projects. But I'll just mention one, and that is how the knowledge base of future studies came to be. It actually began to develop in my mind just as I knew that my first contract at Melbourne Uni was coming to an end and not being renewed. I expect some of you have had that experience when you're moving along quite happily in a job and then you find, oh dear, the contract's not being renewed. What do you do? Well, what a number of us did was to put together a special issue of Futures back in 1993, which tried to put together a kind of model for how this might look. And my point is partly that if that had just come and gone like any other issue, that's where it would have finished. But what happened was that there was so much feedback, so much encouragement, and so much commitment on the part of a lot of people that it was able to proceed beyond that to the 3-volume set of books that we published in '96, and then much later the CD-ROM edition in 2005. The whole point there is that it wasn't one person. It was the collective will of, in the end, nearly 200 people putting together a resource that is still used around the world. I'll flip on now to getting to the heart of things to explain a little bit about what I mean by that. And mention in passing the most recent work that I have published with a very talented young colleague. It was the last issue of Foresight for last year. Topic was descent pathways. And incidentally, it's the very last hard copy of Foresight ever, because we learned afterwards that the publisher has just gone digital. So that's interesting in its own right. But the reason we did the book, that did the special issue, is that the notion of descent pathways addresses the fundamental dilemma, which I think is probably looming large in the conference, that mainstream society and its major institutions have consistently failed to address over the last 40 or 50 years, which is to do with the dangers to the global system, the possible collapse of the global system based on fallacies and contradictions that are becoming unavoidable. This was all described, outlined, rehearsed in the Limits to Growth project over its 40-year period. And I was delighted to discover that Hugo Bardi who's written one of the best books about this, The Limits to Growth Revisited, is actually one of the keynote speakers at this meeting. It's just great that he was invited because I think his work is critical. One of the things that we can do now is to draw to the attention of decision makers and others this re-examination of the Limits to Growth project some years later. Because in my opinion, that project was an enormous gift to humanity that humanity clearly wasn't ready to accept or hear. So coming back to it years later and just reassessing what was going on really makes a lot of sense. The most recent book is by an Australian lady called Karen Higgs, and it's just simply called Collision Course. Again, I've put a copy of the review I wrote about that book for Futures on my weblog, so you can get a quick overview if you're interested. Now, I mentioned the fact that I'd had this time to rest and reflect and think, and what I found happening during that time has really given me a kind of sense of enrichment and inspiration and groundedness that I really couldn't easily manage under normal conditions of working and living and having to earn a living. I'll give you just two quick examples, and then I'll try and wrap up as quickly as I can. I don't know if this will show up on the screen, but I'm holding up a picture here of a painting that's in Berlin's great gallery called the Gemäldegalerie Gallery. And it probably looks like an absolute mess of figures and so forth. Now, this is a painting that was painted back in the 16th century by Peter Bruegel the Elder, and it's called the Netherlandish Proverbs. And if you just look at the surface of that painting, it doesn't make any sense at all, because they're just figures all over the place. You can't make out what's happening. There's no story. My point is this, that when we look at anything on the surface, we're just seeing a tiny part of what's there. Because when you dive into that work and examine it, explore it, listen to it, interrogate it, you actually find out that there's evoked the thoughts and feelings and failures and so forth of a culture centuries ago that would be very hard to get any other way. The second and last example I want to give is that recently you went to a conference about an ornithological conference here in Brisbane, and a chap that I'd never met before stood up and gave a paper about the songs of a tiny little bird called a fairy wren. It's probably only a few grams in weight, and it would, fit in your palm. You wouldn't notice it. Now, I've heard these birds outside. It sounds like a sort of faint whispering sound. They're not very noisy, not very loud. And I'd never given much thought to it. I mean, why would you? It's just one detail. I had no idea that these songs had been recorded and analyzed. I also had no idea about their complexity, the role they play in that species' life and reproduction, and the very specific biological throat adaptations, breathing, etc., that makes it possible in the first place. Finally, and this is what blew me away, I didn't appreciate that the species had been around for at least 1 million years. And here they are, living amongst us, ignored by most people. So through examples of this kind, I've kind of come to understand that there is so much more out there, particularly in depth, that we just don't see unless we stop and pay attention. So to conclude that section, it seems to me that our views of the world can be compared to that, in that humanity has allowed itself to slip into a costly and disturbing trap because it's really not looked in depth at the world, or if it has, it's ignored the work that people have done who have carried out that work. During the 20th century, the deliberate creation of what we call progress looked compelling to many for a while, yet over my lifetime, progress has carved out this really what is an assault on natural systems for a short-term gain. On the other hand, if we can pursue a deeper, richer view, music, art, the natural world are examples of pathways to do that. We can see that the world around us is essentially infinite and has unlimited riches to bestow upon us if we look upon them with humility and care. Looking upon the world with fresh eyes does, in fact, I think, open up new options, refresh and renew our vision, and illuminate pathways beyond dystopia. Now, I know time is short, so I'm going to finish off very quickly with a couple of comments on current practice, because I think that might help to illuminate the so what question. In the last few weeks, I've been asked to do a few presentations for quite conservative groups who know nothing about this sort of thing, people who run cities, people in army intelligence, things like that, really hard-headed people. And what I'm saying to those people is that the future is complex and unpredictable. Therefore, we need to pay closer attention to the signals of change in the present, what we call environmental scanning. I spend half an hour every day doing that work, mostly at the beginning of the day. The point is that you can't really expect to navigate into a turbulent future without paying attention. Now, a couple of exemplars of that you'd be familiar with them might include, say, the Institute for the Future in Palo Alto, or the outfit in Singapore, risk assessment and horizon scanning. Some people in the Federation have helped those people. So I'll give them some examples of how it's done elsewhere. And then I found, I dug out, I'm just about to finish on this, a resource which is particularly handy, this kind of thing for powerful conservative groups who might not otherwise be prepared to even countenance what we're trying to tell them or get them to see. And that's a study that was done last year by a group from the World Economic Forum at Davos, like the high end of corporate and government get-together, but very conventional. It's called Global Risks 2014. And Global Risks 2014 provides an impeccable source for a mainstream audience, one that they can't dismiss because some of the big companies have been involved in creating it in the first place. And in that, there's a diagram of the global risk environment. So very briefly, you can see what's at play here, using the tools, using the language of the group that you're dealing with in order to get across some points that they might otherwise not be prepared to even listen to. So with that in mind, I give them something from the Post-Carbon Institute or the Transition Network to look at how some of these issues that are raised by the big boys and really not taken far enough are carried forward by other people. So I just added that bit in there to show you that the stuff I'm doing is not meant to be just intellectual, not meant to be academic, but it is actually something that I carry into practice currently. And I think I'll leave it there because time is short.
Richard, thank you very much. Would you entertain a few questions?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. And the challenge is out to you. So any questions for Mr. Slaughter? How do you ask a question? Well, I'll break the ice then and ask you I think the paper you're speaking of is Global Challenges, 12 Risks That Threaten Human Civilization.
That's certainly along the same theme, Jim. I'm not sure if it's the same paper. This is actually a study called Global Risks 2014.
Global Risks 20, okay, very good. There's another one.
But it's the same territory.
Okay. All right. very good. Yeah, the 12 risks that threaten human civilization was put together by the Global Challenges Foundation in February of 2015. I'll send you the link on that. It's really very, very well put together, and it links the risks to each other instead of just
Yes.
singularly. So, all right. Not a single question. Okay. Well, Richard, thank you so much for being with us today, and sorry about the delay. I guess
No problem.
all right.
Hope the conference goes well.
All right. Well, shall we give him your hand? That's very good. Okay.
Okay.
Thank
Bye
you.
for now.
Bye bye.